June 4th, 1942. The Pacific dawn broke clear and calm over waters that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, revealing the most powerful naval strike force the world had ever assembled, moving with deadly purpose toward a tiny coral atoll called Midway. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, watching his 4 magnificent flat tops cutting through the gentle swells in perfect formation, the same ships that had delivered death to Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of a carrier task force preparing for battle. Aircraft engines warming up on flight decks, the metallic clatter of ammunition being loaded, and the sharp commands of flight deck officers directing the choreographed chaos that would soon launch hundreds of aircraft against American positions. This was the Kido Butai, the Japanese First Air Fleet, armed with the finest naval aircraft and most experienced pilots in the world. The confidence radiating from every Japanese officer and enlisted man was palpable and entirely justified by their recent string of victories across the Pacific. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviation had swept Allied forces from the seas with methodical precision, sinking battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers while suffering minimal losses in return. The conquest of the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and the advance toward Australia had demonstrated Japanese tactical superiority and strategic vision that seemed destined to reshape the balance of power across the entire Pacific Ocean. Admiral Yamamoto's carefully crafted plan for Midway represented the culmination of this offensive momentum, a decisive battle that would lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a trap where superior Japanese forces could destroy them once and for all. The strategic mathematics seemed overwhelmingly in Japan's favor as Nagumo's carriers approached their launch point 240 miles northwest of Midway Island. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, embarked over 240 of Japan's finest aircraft and most experienced pilots, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that represented the cutting edge of naval technology and tactical doctrine. Intelligence reports indicated that American forces at Midway were minimal and poorly prepared for the type of coordinated assault that Japanese naval aviation had perfected through months of combat operations. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: neutralize Midway's defenses with overwhelming air power, then crush any American fleet units that might respond to the attack, leaving the Pacific open for further Japanese expansion toward Hawaii and the American West Coast. The Japanese admirals had every reason to believe that this would be their greatest victory, the decisive engagement that would force America to accept Japanese domination of the Pacific and negotiate a favorable peace that would preserve their new empire. The morning sun reflected off the flight decks of the 4 carriers as aircraft were spotted for launch, creating a scene of industrial power and military precision that embodied Japanese confidence in their tactical superiority and strategic vision. But hidden beneath the Pacific's deceptively peaceful surface lay intelligence networks, strategic deceptions, and tactical preparations that would transform this day from Japan's greatest triumph into their most catastrophic naval defeat. But what happens when 4 mighty carriers sail into a trap set by American codebreakers? The strategic situation that led to the Battle of Midway had its roots in Japanese ambitions for Pacific dominance that extended far beyond the immediate military objectives of neutralizing American naval power and securing resource-rich territories throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The attack on Pearl Harbor had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted devastating damage on the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but it had failed to accomplish the strategic objective of forcing America out of the Pacific War before American industrial capacity could be mobilized for sustained military operations. Instead of seeking negotiated peace, American public opinion had hardened into determination for total victory, while President Roosevelt and his military advisors began planning the massive industrial and military mobilization that would ultimately prove decisive in the Pacific conflict. Japanese naval strategy in early 1942 reflected the understanding that time was working against their long-term strategic position, as American industrial capacity far exceeded Japanese production capabilities and would eventually translate into overwhelming material superiority if the war continued for extended periods. Admiral Yamamoto and other senior Japanese commanders recognized that achieving decisive victory required eliminating American naval power in the Pacific before American shipyards could replace the losses suffered at Pearl Harbor and begin producing the new carriers, battleships, and cruisers that were already under construction in American naval yards. The window for Japanese strategic success was measured in months rather than years, creating pressure for aggressive operations that would force decisive engagements before American strength could recover. The Doolittle Raid on April 18, 1942, had profound psychological and strategic implications for Japanese planning that extended far beyond the minimal physical damage inflicted by 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet against targets in Japan itself. The raid demonstrated that Japanese home islands were vulnerable to American attack despite the supposedly impregnable defensive perimeter that had been established across the Pacific, undermining public confidence in Japanese military invincibility while forcing strategic resources to be diverted to homeland defense. More significantly, the raid convinced Japanese military leaders that American carrier forces represented an existential threat that had to be eliminated through decisive battle before they could mount larger and more devastating attacks against Japanese territory. The strategic planning that produced the Midway operation reflected Japanese understanding that American naval strength in the Pacific was concentrated in a handful of surviving aircraft carriers that represented the only remaining threat to Japanese expansion and consolidation of their Pacific conquests. Intelligence estimates suggested that the United States possessed only 2 or 3 operational carriers in the Pacific theater. Forces that were inadequate for defending the vast distances involved in Pacific warfare, but potentially dangerous if concentrated for surprise attacks against Japanese positions or supply lines. Yamamoto's plan was designed to force these carriers into battle under conditions where superior Japanese forces could destroy them, eliminating American naval power in the Pacific for the duration of the war. The Japanese plan for Midway was characteristically complex and ambitious, involving simultaneous operations across thousands of miles of ocean that required precise timing and coordination between multiple task forces operating independently beyond mutual support range. The main carrier strike force under Admiral Nagumo would attack Midway Island to destroy its air defenses and facilities, while a separate invasion force would capture the island and establish Japanese control over this strategic position that dominated the Central Pacific shipping lanes. Additional Japanese forces would conduct diversionary attacks against the Aleutian Islands to confuse American intelligence and potentially draw American naval forces away from the main battle area. The plan assumed that American carriers would respond to these attacks and could be engaged and destroyed by superior Japanese forces operating with the advantages of tactical initiative and numerical superiority. American intelligence capabilities in early 1942 represented one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, as cryptanalysts working under extremely difficult conditions had achieved partial success in breaking Japanese naval codes that provided crucial insights into enemy strategic planning and operational intentions. The work of codebreakers at Pearl Harbor and Washington had revealed enough details about the Midway operation to alert Admiral Nimitz to the general outline of Japanese plans, enabling American forces to prepare defensive measures and position available naval forces where they could potentially achieve tactical surprise despite their numerical inferiority. This intelligence advantage was so sensitive that only a handful of senior officers were permitted access to the information, and elaborate deception measures were implemented to prevent Japanese forces from discovering that their codes had been compromised. Admiral Chester Nimitz faced strategic choices that would determine not only the outcome of the Midway operation, but potentially the entire course of the Pacific War, as the loss of America's remaining carrier forces would leave the Pacific Fleet incapable of offensive operations for years, while Japanese forces consolidated their conquests and prepared for further expansion. The decision to commit all available Pacific Fleet carriers to the defense of Midway represented an enormous strategic gamble, as defeat would eliminate American naval aviation capabilities and leave the west coast of the United States vulnerable to Japanese attack. However, intelligence information about Japanese plans provided an opportunity to achieve tactical surprise that might offset American numerical disadvantages and potentially inflict significant losses on Japanese forces that had previously seemed invincible. The preparation of American naval forces for the Midway operation required extraordinary efforts to repair battle damage, train replacement air crews, and coordinate tactical plans under extreme time pressure that left little margin for error or equipment failure. The carrier Yorktown, severely damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, underwent emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor that would normally have required months, but were completed in less than 72 hours through round-the-clock work by naval shipyard personnel who understood the strategic importance of getting every possible American ship into the battle. Similarly, air groups were hastily reorganized and equipped with aircraft that in many cases were not fully tested or optimally configured for the combat missions they would be required to perform. The tactical challenges facing American naval aviation at Midway were enormous, as relatively inexperienced pilots flying older aircraft would be required to locate, attack, and hopefully sink some of the most heavily defended warships afloat, manned by crews who had demonstrated consistent tactical superiority in previous engagements. American torpedo bombers were known to be vulnerable to Japanese fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft fire, while dive bombers had limited range that would require them to approach close enough to enemy carriers to ensure accuracy while avoiding the concentrated defensive fires that protected Japanese task forces. The coordination required to mass American striking power at the decisive moment would test communication systems, navigation capabilities, and tactical doctrine that had never been fully validated under combat conditions. The strategic stakes involved in the Midway operation were understood by commanders on both sides, as the outcome would likely determine whether Japan could consolidate its Pacific conquests and force a negotiated peace with the United States, or whether American forces would retain the naval capabilities necessary for eventual offensive operations that could threaten Japanese positions throughout the Pacific. The concentration of Japanese carrier aviation at Midway represented both an opportunity and a risk for Japanese strategic planning, as victory would eliminate American naval threats for the foreseeable future, while defeat could cripple Japanese offensive capabilities and leave their extended defense perimeter vulnerable to American counterattacks. The battle would be decided not only by tactical skill and equipment capabilities, but by the complex interplay of intelligence, logistics, and strategic decision-making that characterized the broader Pacific conflict. The battle began in darkness at 04:30 hours when 108 Japanese aircraft launched from the 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, their engines creating a thunderous roar that echoed across the calm Pacific waters as pilots prepared to deliver what they expected would be the decisive blow against American resistance at Midway Island. Admiral Nagumo watched from Akagi's bridge as Kate torpedo bombers, Val dive bombers, and Zero fighters formed up in precise formations that demonstrated the tactical proficiency and coordination that had made Japanese naval aviation feared throughout the Pacific. The sight of so many aircraft departing simultaneously from 4 flight decks represented the culmination of years of training, doctrine development, and combat experience that had elevated Japanese carrier operations to levels of effectiveness that no other navy could match. As the strike force disappeared toward the eastern horizon, confidence pervaded the Japanese fleet that Midway's defenses would be eliminated within hours. The American response began almost immediately, as radar operators on Midway detected the incoming Japanese strike and transmitted warnings that sent every available aircraft scrambling to intercept the attackers or escape destruction on the ground. Marine Corps and Navy fighter pilots, flying hopelessly obsolete aircraft against vastly superior Japanese Zeros, attacked the bomber formations with desperate courage that achieved little tactical success but demonstrated the determination that would characterize American resistance throughout the Pacific War. The unequal aerial combat over Midway resulted in predictable Japanese victory, with American fighters shot down in large numbers while inflicting minimal losses on the attacking force. However, the sacrifice of these pilots provided crucial time for ground defenses to prepare and for American reconnaissance aircraft to locate and report the position of the Japanese carrier force that was now revealed and vulnerable to counterattack. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group from the cockpit of his SBD Dauntless dive bomber, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours when fuel gauges indicated that his aircraft were approaching the point where they would be unable to return to their carrier if the enemy was not located soon. The Pacific seemed empty of targets despite intelligence reports that had placed Japanese carriers in this area, and McCluskey faced the agonizing decision between continuing the search and risking the loss of his entire air group to fuel exhaustion, or returning to Enterprise with the mission incomplete and the Japanese fleet still able to operate with impunity. His decision to extend the search for another 30 minutes, based on intuition rather than scientific calculation, would prove to be one of the most crucial tactical choices in naval history. The Japanese carriers had been maneuvering to recover their Midway strike force, while simultaneously preparing follow-up attacks against American surface forces that reconnaissance aircraft had reported in the area, creating a period of vulnerability when flight decks were cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance that could not be quickly cleared if enemy attacks materialized. Admiral Nagumo's tactical dilemma reflected the fundamental challenge of carrier operations, the need to maintain continuous air operations while remaining prepared for immediate defensive action against enemy attacks that could appear with minimal warning. The decision to rearm returning aircraft for anti-ship attacks rather than maintaining them in anti-aircraft configuration would prove catastrophic when American dive bombers finally appeared over the Japanese fleet. McCluskey spotted the Japanese destroyer Arashi racing northward toward the main carrier force at maximum speed, creating a distinctive wake that pointed directly toward the enemy fleet like an arrow drawn across the ocean's surface. The destroyer was attempting to rejoin the formation after being left behind during anti-submarine operations, but its course provided the navigational reference that American pilots desperately needed to locate targets that had remained hidden by weather and the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. Following the destroyer's wake, McCluskey's dive bombers climbed to attack altitude and prepared for the assault that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War in a matter of minutes. The sight that greeted American pilots as they approached the Japanese fleet was almost overwhelming in its tactical significance. 4 aircraft carriers steaming in formation with their flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ammunition that created ideal conditions for catastrophic damage if American bombs could penetrate the defensive screen and reach their targets. The carriers appeared to be defensively positioned, but operationally vulnerable, as their air groups were either engaged over Midway or in the process of landing and refueling, leaving minimal fighter cover immediately available to intercept attacking American aircraft. McCluskey's decision to attack immediately, before Japanese fighters could climb to intercept altitude, represented tactical opportunism that capitalized on enemy vulnerability at the precise moment when it was most exploitable. The dive-bombing attack that began at 10:20 hours represented the culmination of months of training and tactical development that had prepared American naval aviators for precisely this type of engagement against the most valuable and heavily defended targets in the Japanese fleet. McCluskey's SBD Dauntless aircraft rolled into their bombing dives with mechanical precision, each pilot selecting individual aim points on carrier flight decks while maintaining formation discipline that concentrated their attacks for maximum psychological and physical impact. The steep diving angle of 70 degrees required exceptional pilot skill to maintain accurate aim, while pulling out of the dive at altitudes low enough to ensure bomb accuracy, but high enough to avoid destruction from their own explosions. The first American bomb to find its target struck the carrier Kaga near the island superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and detonating among aircraft that were being refueled and rearmed for the next mission. The explosion ignited aviation gasoline and ammunition that created secondary blasts throughout the hangar deck, transforming the carrier from an operational warship into a blazing inferno within seconds of impact. Japanese damage control parties, trained to respond to battle damage with systematic efficiency, found themselves overwhelmed by fires that spread faster than they could be contained, while secondary explosions from stored ordnance made firefighting efforts suicidal for crew members who attempted to save their ship. Simultaneously, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown attacked the carriers Akagi and Sōryū with similar devastating results, their bombs penetrating flight decks and detonating in spaces crowded with fuel, aircraft, and ammunition that created the perfect conditions for catastrophic damage. The carrier Akagi, flagship of the Japanese carrier force and symbol of naval aviation supremacy, was transformed into a blazing wreck by 3 bomb hits that ignited fires throughout the ship and made her uninhabitable within minutes. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser, watched in horror as the pride of the Japanese fleet burned out of control, while his staff struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen their previously invincible force. The carrier Sōryū suffered perhaps the most devastating attack as American dive bombers achieved perfect concentration of their bomb pattern, with multiple hits penetrating the flight deck and exploding simultaneously in the hangar spaces below. The resulting fires and explosions were so intense that the carrier's structure was compromised within minutes, while emergency evacuation procedures were implemented for crew members who could not remain aboard a ship that was literally disintegrating around them. The sight of 3 Japanese carriers burning simultaneously created a psychological impact on both sides that exceeded the tactical significance of the attacks, as it became clear that Japanese naval supremacy was being destroyed in real time by American pilots who had achieved the impossible through skill, courage, and exceptional tactical timing. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryū, had been separated from the main formation and initially escaped the coordinated American attack that had destroyed her three sister ships. Her aircraft immediately began preparing retaliatory strikes against the American carriers that had been located by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, demonstrating the resilience and tactical competence that had characterized Japanese naval aviation throughout the war. The strikes launched by Hiryū achieved partial success against the carrier Yorktown, proving that Japanese pilots retained their combat effectiveness despite the catastrophic losses suffered by their fleet. However, the isolated position of the remaining Japanese carrier made her vulnerable to follow-up American attacks that were already being organized by air groups from Enterprise and Hornet. The second wave of American attacks, launched in the afternoon against the surviving Japanese carrier, demonstrated the tactical advantages that had been achieved through the morning's success, as American pilots could now concentrate their entire striking power against a single target that lacked adequate fighter protection or supporting vessels. The dive-bombing attack that finally destroyed Hiryū was executed with the same precision and coordination that had characterized the morning strikes, with multiple bomb hits transforming the last operational Japanese carrier into a burning hulk that would sink before midnight. The destruction of all four Japanese carriers within a single day represented a tactical achievement that exceeded the most optimistic American expectations and fundamentally altered the strategic balance of power in the Pacific Ocean. Japanese pilots attempting to return from their strikes against Midway and American carriers found themselves without flight decks to land on, forced to ditch their aircraft in the ocean or attempt emergency landings on other ships that lacked the facilities to recover carrier aircraft safely. The loss of nearly 300 aircraft and their experienced pilots represented an irreplaceable blow to Japanese naval aviation capabilities that would require years to rebuild even under optimal conditions. The sight of Japanese pilots floating in life rafts while their carriers burned nearby created a powerful symbol of the reversal of fortune that had transformed the most powerful naval striking force in the world into a collection of burning wrecks and scattered survivors within the space of a few hours. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel who witnessed the destruction of their fleet was profound and lasting, as men who had participated in an unbroken string of victories found themselves struggling to comprehend how such overwhelming tactical success could be transformed into complete disaster through the actions of numerically inferior American forces. Radio communications intercepted by American intelligence revealed the shock and disbelief among Japanese commanders who were attempting to coordinate damage control efforts while simultaneously trying to understand how their tactical and strategic planning had resulted in such catastrophic failure. The confidence that had characterized Japanese naval operations since Pearl Harbor was shattered as completely as the four carriers that lay burning on the Pacific surface. American pilots returning to their carriers carried with them eyewitness accounts of destruction that exceeded anything in previous naval combat, as they described the sight of four massive warships simultaneously burning out of control, while Japanese sailors abandoned ship or died attempting to save vessels that were beyond salvation. The tactical success achieved by American naval aviation at Midway represented validation of training, equipment, and tactical doctrine that had been developed despite limited resources and combat experience, proving that American industrial capacity and military training could compete successfully with the best that Japanese forces could offer. The psychological boost provided by such complete and unexpected victory would sustain American naval morale throughout the difficult campaigns that lay ahead in the Pacific War. The psychological shock that reverberated through Japanese naval commands following the loss of four fleet carriers in a single day created a crisis of confidence that would influence Japanese strategic planning and tactical operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Senior officers who had witnessed the destruction of the Kido Butai struggled to comprehend how their seemingly invincible carrier force had been eliminated by numerically inferior American forces using tactics and equipment that Japanese intelligence had consistently underestimated. The reports reaching Admiral Yamamoto aboard his flagship described losses so catastrophic that they initially seemed impossible to believe, forcing a fundamental reassessment of American capabilities and Japanese vulnerabilities that would influence every subsequent naval operation. The immediate strategic implications of the Midway disaster forced Japanese high command to abandon offensive operations throughout the Pacific and transition to defensive strategies designed to preserve remaining naval assets while attempting to consolidate control over existing conquests. The loss of 4 carriers and their experienced air groups eliminated Japanese capability to conduct major offensive operations for the foreseeable future. While American industrial capacity was beginning to produce new carriers and aircraft at rates that would restore and eventually overwhelm Japanese naval strength. The strategic initiative that Japan had maintained since Pearl Harbor passed irreversibly to American forces who now possessed both the tactical confidence and material resources necessary for sustained offensive operations. American strategic planning underwent immediate and dramatic revision as intelligence reports confirmed the complete destruction of Japanese carrier aviation that had dominated Pacific naval operations for 6 months. Admiral Nimitz and his staff began developing offensive operations that would have been impossible while Japanese carriers remained operational, including amphibious assaults against fortified island positions and carrier raids against Japanese bases throughout the Pacific. The psychological impact of achieving such complete tactical success provided American commanders with confidence that Japanese forces could be defeated through superior tactics, training, and equipment, despite their previous reputation for tactical invincibility and fanatical resistance. The industrial and logistical consequences of Midway's outcome became apparent within weeks as American shipyards accelerated carrier construction programs while Japanese yards struggled to replace losses that represented years of construction time and specialized manufacturing capability. The 4 Japanese carriers destroyed at Midway had required over 3 years each to build and outfit with trained crews, while American shipyards were already launching new carriers at intervals measured in months rather than years. More significantly, the loss of experienced Japanese pilots created training and personnel bottlenecks that would prove impossible to overcome given Japan's limited resources and industrial capacity compared to American production capabilities. The intelligence implications of American success at Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical benefits to influence the broader conduct of the Pacific War. As Japanese commanders began questioning the security of their communications and planning processes without discovering the extent to which their codes had been compromised. The apparent American ability to anticipate Japanese strategic moves and position forces optimally for defensive operations created paranoia and uncertainty that would handicap Japanese planning throughout the remainder of the war. American code-breaking success remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the conflict, but its strategic value was proven by the Midway operation that had transformed certain Japanese victory into catastrophic defeat. The human cost of the Midway disaster was measured not only in the thousands of Japanese sailors who died aboard their burning ships, but also in the irreplaceable loss of experienced pilots who represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation and whose training and combat experience could not be quickly replaced. The pilot training programs that had produced Japan's naval aviation elite required years to complete and depended on resources that were no longer available as the war economy struggled to meet the basic requirements of maintaining existing forces. American pilot training programs, by contrast, were expanding rapidly and producing aircrew in numbers that would eventually overwhelm Japanese capabilities, despite individual qualitative advantages that Japanese pilots had previously enjoyed. The propaganda and morale implications of the Midway outcome were carefully managed by both sides, with Japanese media minimizing the extent of the defeat, while American publications celebrated the victory as evidence of inevitable triumph over Japanese aggression. However, the strategic reality could not be concealed from military personnel on both sides who understood that the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively in favor of American forces. Japanese morale, which had been sustained by an unbroken series of victories since Pearl Harbor, began showing signs of decline as news of the disaster spread through the fleet, despite official attempts at censorship and information control. The diplomatic consequences of Midway influenced neutral nations and potential Japanese allies, who had been impressed by early Japanese victories, but now began questioning the long-term prospects for Japanese success in the Pacific War. The demonstration that American naval forces could compete successfully with elite Japanese units encouraged Allied resistance throughout the Pacific, while discouraging potential Japanese supporters who had been considering alignment with what had appeared to be the winning side. The strategic balance that had favored Japanese expansion since Pearl Harbor was fundamentally altered by evidence of American tactical competence and industrial potential that would eventually prove decisive. Medical and rescue operations following the battle provided graphic evidence of the destruction that modern naval warfare could inflict, as survivors from the sunken Japanese carriers were recovered with injuries that reflected the intensity of the fires and explosions that had consumed their ships. American rescue efforts, conducted despite ongoing combat operations, demonstrated the humanitarian principles that distinguish democratic military operations from totalitarian approaches to warfare. The treatment of Japanese prisoners and survivors would influence post-war relationships and contribute to eventual reconciliation between former enemies who had fought with mutual respect despite ideological differences. The technological lessons learned from Midway influenced aircraft design, ship construction, and tactical doctrine development for both navies, as the battle demonstrated the decisive importance of carrier aviation while revealing vulnerabilities in ship design and damage control procedures that had not been apparent during peacetime operations. American success validated the effectiveness of dive bombing tactics and SBD dauntless aircraft that had been criticized as obsolescent, while Japanese losses highlighted the dangers of operating carriers with inadequate fighter protection and vulnerability to catastrophic damage from relatively small numbers of accurate bomb hits. The long-term strategic consequences of Midway established the foundation for American offensive operations that would eventually drive Japanese forces back across the Pacific through a series of amphibious campaigns that would have been impossible while Japanese carrier aviation remained operational. The confidence gained from achieving such complete tactical success at Midway provided American commanders with the strategic vision necessary for planning operations that would culminate in the invasion of Japan itself. The battle that Japanese planners had intended as the decisive victory, ensuring their Pacific empire, instead became the turning point that doomed their imperial ambitions and began the long retreat that would end with Japan's surrender 3 years later. The Battle of Midway represented a decisive validation of American carrier design philosophy that emphasized damage control capabilities, crew survivability, and operational flexibility over the speed and aircraft capacity that had characterized Japanese carrier construction priorities. American carriers like Enterprise and Hornet incorporated sophisticated damage control systems, redundant power and communication networks, and compartmentalized design features that enabled them to survive battle damage that would have crippled Japanese vessels with similar weaponry. The survival of Yorktown, despite multiple torpedo and bomb hits, demonstrated the effectiveness of American naval architecture, while the catastrophic loss of all 4 Japanese carriers highlighted vulnerabilities in their design that made them susceptible to catastrophic damage from relatively minor hits in critical areas. The technological superiority demonstrated by American dive-bombing accuracy at Midway reflected advances in bomb sights, pilot training, and tactical coordination that had been developed through systematic analysis of combat requirements and extensive practice under realistic conditions. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers that destroyed the Japanese carrier force incorporated technological improvements in structural strength, defensive armament, and bombing accuracy that enabled them to survive Japanese fighter attacks while delivering their ordnance with precision that exceeded peacetime training standards. The coordination between different air groups attacking simultaneously from multiple directions demonstrated tactical sophistication that had been achieved through standardized training programs and communication procedures that enabled effective cooperation between units that had never previously operated together. The intelligence revolution represented by American code-breaking success provided strategic advantages that transcended traditional measures of military capability by enabling inferior forces to achieve tactical surprise and concentrate their limited resources at the decisive point where they could inflict maximum damage on enemy operations. The ability to intercept and decode Japanese communications provided American commanders with information about enemy intentions, capabilities, and vulnerabilities that enabled optimal positioning of available forces and timing of operations for maximum effectiveness. This intelligence capability represented a form of technological advantage that was invisible to casual observers but proved more decisive than superiority in conventional weapons or numerical strength. The industrial implications of carrier construction and replacement revealed fundamental differences between American and Japanese approaches to wartime production that would prove decisive over the extended duration of the Pacific conflict. American shipyards were designed for mass production using standardized components, interchangeable parts, and assembly line techniques that enabled rapid construction of large numbers of vessels with consistent quality and capability. Japanese shipbuilding, by contrast, emphasized individual craftsmanship and custom construction that produced superior individual vessels but could not be scaled to meet the production requirements of extended warfare against an industrially superior opponent. The pilot training programs that supported carrier aviation operations demonstrated the critical importance of human resources and educational systems in determining the outcome of technologically intensive military operations. American pilot training was organized as an industrial process that could produce large numbers of competent aircrew through standardized curricula, systematic evaluation procedures, and abundant training resources that enabled rapid expansion of aviation capabilities. Japanese pilot training remained rooted in artisan traditions that produced exceptional individual pilots, but could not be expanded rapidly enough to replace combat losses while maintaining quality standards necessary for effective carrier operations. The logistical systems that supported carrier operations in the Pacific revealed the decisive importance of industrial capacity and organizational efficiency in sustaining complex military operations across vast distances and extended time periods. American logistics capabilities enabled continuous operations with minimal interruption for maintenance, resupply, or personnel replacement, while Japanese forces struggled with shortages of fuel, spare parts, and replacement equipment that limited their operational tempo and strategic flexibility. The ability to maintain high levels of operational readiness while simultaneously expanding force capabilities represented a form of strategic advantage that proved more important than tactical or technological superiority in individual engagements. The communications and coordination technologies that enabled effective carrier operations required integration of radar systems, radio networks, and tactical procedures that allowed commanders to control complex air operations while maintaining situational awareness of rapidly changing tactical conditions. American success at Midway demonstrated the effectiveness of these systems under combat conditions, while Japanese failures highlighted vulnerabilities in their command and control capabilities that limited their ability to respond effectively to unexpected tactical developments. The technological sophistication required for effective carrier operations exceeded anything previously attempted in naval warfare and established requirements for electronic systems that would influence military technology development for decades. The strategic doctrine that emerged from Midway analysis emphasized the decisive importance of achieving tactical surprise through superior intelligence, coordinated operations involving multiple types of units, and concentration of force at the critical time and place where maximum advantage could be achieved. The battle demonstrated that numerical superiority could be overcome through better information, superior planning, and more effective execution of complex tactical operations under time pressure. These lessons influenced American strategic planning throughout the remainder of the war and established principles that would guide military thinking during the post-war period when technological complexity and strategic uncertainty would require similar capabilities. The technological legacy of Midway influenced post-war naval development programs that emphasized the integration of aviation, electronics, and weapons systems into comprehensive platforms capable of projecting power across global distances, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for operations against diverse threats under varying conditions. The Carrier Task Force organization that proved decisive at Midway became the foundation for American naval strategy throughout the Cold War period, while the technological capabilities demonstrated during the battle established requirements for advanced systems that would eventually evolve into modern naval aviation and precision strike capabilities that continue to influence contemporary military operations. The profound irony of June 4, 1942, lay in the transformation of Japan's most carefully planned offensive operation into the decisive moment when their naval supremacy was irreversibly shattered by the very forces they had sought to destroy. Admiral Yamamoto's strategic vision of eliminating American carrier aviation through decisive battle was achieved in reverse, as Japanese carrier aviation was instead eliminated by American forces who had turned the trap back upon its creators through superior intelligence, tactical innovation, and industrial capacity that had been consistently underestimated by Japanese planners. The sight of 4 proud carriers burning simultaneously on the Pacific surface became the symbol not of Japanese victory, but of the beginning of their long retreat across the ocean they had once dominated with seemingly invincible power. The human dimension of this strategic reversal transcended the immediate tactical results to encompass the broader implications of democratic military effectiveness, competing successfully against totalitarian systems that had appeared to possess decisive advantages in training, experience, and tactical doctrine. The American pilots who achieved this unprecedented victory were not elite specialists or carefully selected warriors, but ordinary citizens who had been transformed into effective military professionals through systematic training programs that emphasized technical competence and coordinated operations over individual heroism or ideological indoctrination. Their success demonstrated that democratic societies could produce military capabilities that exceeded those of authoritarian systems, despite apparent disadvantages in unity of command and military tradition. The strategic implications of Midway established the foundation for American victory in the Pacific through industrial mobilization and technological innovation that would eventually overwhelm Japanese capabilities despite their continued tactical competence and determined resistance. The battle marked the irreversible shift from Japanese offensive operations to defensive strategies that could only delay rather than prevent American advance across the Pacific toward Japan itself. The carriers that burned at Midway carried with them not only experienced pilots and sophisticated aircraft, but also Japanese hopes for a negotiated peace that would preserve their Pacific empire and establish Japan as the dominant power in East Asia. The legacy of June 4, 1942, continues to influence naval warfare and strategic thinking as a demonstration that intelligence, industrial capacity, and tactical innovation can overcome apparent disadvantages in numbers, experience, and traditional measures of military strength. The transformation of certain Japanese victory into catastrophic defeat within the space of a few hours proved that modern warfare rewards preparation, adaptability, and technological sophistication rather than simply courage and tactical tradition. Midway became the day when American industrial democracy proved its superiority over Japanese militarism through the simple but decisive fact that 4 carriers could be destroyed in a single morning by forces that had learned to fight smarter rather than just harder than their enemies. If you want more untold stories of World War II, subscribe now to WW2 Secret Archives, where history's darkest secrets are revealed.